Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for this the June edition of What Are You Reading? We have all of our librarians here, and we have a new face replacing KRISTIN, who couldn't make it here this month. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to mention our summer reading challenge, which you can get started at thegdl.org/beanstack. You can find all the information there about how you can sign up, all the great prizes you can win, and how to get started. And if you have any questions, you can always leave a comment here on this stream as well. We have a lot of good books to talk about this month, and let's just sort of dive into it. If you are watching this for the first time, we do this every month where we talk with our librarians about different books they've enjoyed reading or recommending or would like to recommend. And if you're listening to this and watching this, you can leave a comment, and we'd like to comment on what you books you've read recently, and just hear what you have to say about the books that we talk about. So we'll go ahead and jump right into this. If Chris, do you want to talk about your first book?
Sure. The first one I'm going to talk about, I know Sherry has read, so if she wants to jump in at any time, it's The Girls in the Stilt House by Kelly Mustian. It's a highly reviewed book that was recommended due to its depiction of place as a character. And it's set on the Natchez Trace in Mississippi. It covers the story of two young women and how they learn to face life's adversities. The characters were so vivid. I really enjoyed the characters in the story. I could totally see this as a Netflix miniseries. I did find the ending to be a little lackluster, but the author explains why that is so in the endnotes. So I gave it 4 stars, and if you liked Where the Crawdads Sing, definitely give this book a try.
What is it you didn't like about the ending? Can you mention that without giving too much away?
I think it was just because there was so much emotional stuff going on throughout the story that the ending just kind of went floop. I don't know how to describe it without saying too much. It just didn't have that oomph that I was looking for, I guess, or hoping for, I should say.
You did. Sure, that makes sense. Sherry, how did you feel about it? Do you have similar thoughts, or what were your thoughts on the ending?
I would agree with Chris that the ending was it seemed like it just kind of chopped off a little too early for me. But the rest of the book was really good, and I think it would make a really good book for book clubs. There was a lot to discuss there.
Yes.
So it would definitely be a good choice for a book club.
Awesome. Okay, well, we'll go clockwise around this circle here. What do you want to talk about first, Sherry?
Nature of Witches by Rachel Griffin. It's teen fiction, and it's in this book, most witches' power is tied to one season, and they use their powers to maintain the climate. However, because of climate change, this is becoming difficult. So enter Clara. She's a rare ever witch whose magic is tied to all the seasons. Unfortunately, Clara struggles with her magic. It's undisciplined, and she feels like it's taken her parents and her best friend from her. She isolates herself on campus at a magical school where the teens learn to use their powers. And she plans to let the upcoming eclipse strip her powers. Then Sang Park, who's a botanist, a graduate student, and a calming spring witch, enters the picture. He's assigned to train her, and Clara begins to have feelings for him, and she gets terrified that her magic will seek him out and destroy him. I like this book. The premise of it's timely with the climate change aspect, and I couldn't put it down. It's definitely one that'll stick with me for a little while.
It reminds me a little bit, too, of the one you spoke about last month. I can't remember the name. That was also kind of a magic school sort of element to it. What was it called?
Oh, the House in the Cerulean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a theme of things you talked about. Who would you recommend this book to? What sort of things?
It's teen fiction, but the kids aren't in what amounts to college. So I think it might be good for like young adults. I enjoyed it, and I'm definitely not close to a teenager. But anyone who's interested in like climate change or witchy fantasy books would be good for.
I think that's an interesting element to the climate change aspect. Is an interesting sort of twist. It's a neat idea. All right, Nancy, what is your first recommendation you want to make to people?
Oh, I've got Circe. I managed to grab a copy off the shelf because it's at least a year old. So if you're looking for it, you can find it on the shelf. I like to read about Greek gods and goddesses, and I also like the witch stories. And Circe is both. She's the daughter of Helios, the sun god, and Perse, who was an ocean nymph. And she gets banished to an island by Zeus. So she's kind of alone, and you're watching her struggle both as a woman and a witch. She's discovering her powers. And Odysseus and his crew show up on a ship, and they intend to do her harm. And you almost don't feel sorry for them, but she turns them all into pigs and keeps them corralled. So she's got serious powers, and she's dangerous. And something about this book, this is by Madeline Miller, and I came to appreciate her writing style. It's almost stilted. It's almost like you're reading history. It doesn't flow like fiction. Like you can't read the whole book in 2 days. And I also read her book about Achilles. I got interested in her other characters and read them all. And her writing is like that all throughout her books. But you want to read it all the way through, and it's just a different take on one of the goddesses. So I try to read as many of those as I can.
That's an interesting idea, like written more like history. Sherry, I think you and I talked about this book before too, right?
I think so. I've read it before. It's been a while, but I really enjoyed it too.
And I know KRISTIN really enjoyed it too. She recommended it to me a while ago. So it seems to be a favorite here among us. Chris, what do you want to talk about next?
Okay, so June this last month since we met has been kind of a rough month for me. The next book I'm going to talk about is probably not going to go well over with people who've already read this book. It's The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Honestly, I understand why so many people love this book, but for me, it was just meh. And I know that is like an unpopular opinion. And I couldn't decide if I wanted to talk about it because I didn't really like it. But I thought, it's probably good for people to hear that there are books that we don't like too. and I thought, because this one's so popular and so many people absolutely love this book, that it would be okay for me to say that I didn't really like it. I enjoyed reading the different books of Nora. That was really fun for me as she moved to different times where she regretted decisions that she made. But I just didn't enjoy the interactions with the librarian. And I think that's kind of funny because I'm a librarian. But the librarian in the book seemed so robotic to me that I just really didn't care for those chapters at all. So I also felt like the ending was a disappointment. It didn't measure up to the promises made throughout the book. And I felt a little talked at toward the ending of the book, primarily from the librarian, which I also didn't like. So I wasn't a fan of this story.
So, yeah, I think it's a good point that, we don't have to enjoy every book that we read. What have you heard about the book that made you want to read it in the first place? And you see, like, it's a pretty popular book. What are the things that other people seem to enjoy? Can you kind of see what they like in it?
I think so. When I finished it, I went and looked at some of the other reviews, and I looked at my, like my friends who have read it and reviewed it, and they all love I guess the message of being able to live in the day or live in the moment, or don't think that all your mistakes are necessarily things that define you. So I think it was that people really enjoyed the kind of the positive message of life. I don't know how else to describe it. And so maybe I was just not in the right frame of mind at the time that I read it to be in
Sure.
that, philosophical position. I don't know.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting to hear what people like or don't like books, or what their take on it. It's still interesting to hear. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Well, and I think also people really liked the notion of the library and the stories. So like the main character, she gets to go and pull a book off the shelf, and it's a story, it's a book about her life. And I think that also appealed a lot to people. And that was part of the story that I liked. So anyway.
All right, Sherry, what do you want to talk about next?
The Godmothers by Camille Aubrey. It's a sweeping saga featuring 4 strong women who are related by marriage in an Italian family with ties to the mob. It takes place from the 1930s to the 1950s, so it's historical fiction. It focuses on Petrina, Lucy, Amy, and Philomena. Their husbands are in and out of the picture for various reasons. Since they're connected to the mob, you can guess some of the reasons why they're in and out of the picture. And the women do everything they can to make sure that their family survives. It's sprinkled throughout with real mobsters. And this book maintains focus on the women in the family and their relationship to each other. I love the women-focused story, and I also like the fact that they don't romanticize the mob. You see the bad along with the little bit of good that is in there. It's definitely not a story where they're like, oh, the mob is great. The characters are really strong, and I think it would be good for those who enjoyed The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, just because it's kind of the same family saga type of feel.
There we go. Do you read a lot of crime novels, Sherry?
I would say more thrillers than crime. The Mob is not my favorite, but I read a previous book by this author that I liked, so I took a chance on it, and I think I loved this one more than I liked her last one.
Ooh. What was her previous one? Do you remember?
Something about Picasso, but it was historical fiction relating to Pablo Picasso and his life and his relationships with women. And it was okay, but this one was much.
All right. Nancy, what would you like to talk about next?
Well, first, Chris, I wanted to say that I've heard that from a lot of other people about the Midnight Library. Our page, Karen, did not like it, and she reads 1 million books a month. And I read it, and I liked it just because anything that says library, I'm up for a good story. But a lot of people didn't like that one. So the next book, it just so happened that I had just read it, is Ariadne by Jennifer Saint, and that's another Greek goddess. This book just came out, so you might need to put it on a hold list. She's the princess of Crete, and her father is Minos, and her brother is the Minotaur, and he's this horrifying half bull, half human who wanders the tunnels underneath their palace, and they bring people in to feed to him. So there's a horrifying element to this story. Ariadne grows up with him, and when Theseus, the prince of Athens, arrives, he's supposed to be fed to the beast as well, and she ends up helping him escape, and he lies to her. She fancies herself attracted to him, and he lies to her and takes her with him. She thinks she's going to be his queen, and she ends up being dropped off on an island. So she's on an island also, like Circe, and she's got to figure herself out, her powers out, and how to live on the island. But there's a positive ending. The island is actually owned by Dionysus, and he comes and she ends up being married to him and fathering his children. So it's just another angle, and it kind of brings the gods and goddesses to life. It's another angle to the all of the stories. So I like to read a lot of different authors, and it kind of all comes together for the gods and goddesses.
I like having the theme here in your recommendation so far. What part of like mythology do you really enjoy?
Anything to do with Zeus, and it kind of ties into Thor and Loki and the Avengers and all, you can kind of, when I see references to Thor and Zeus in my stories, I appreciate that. So I don't know. I mean, it's all fantasy. I consider the gods and goddesses just fantasy reading, and but at the same time, it's almost historical fiction. So I feel like I'm better educating myself, even though I'm reading fiction.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right, Chris, what do you have next?
Next, I'm going to go with a throwback. So it's the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Society by Marianne Schaefer and Annie Barrows. This book has been around a long time. I consider it a classic. I've given it 5 stars. I know lots of people have read it and enjoyed it. So I read it about 10 years ago, and it's stayed with me all these years. When people come looking for a recommendation, it's one of my tried and true titles that I recommend to people. It was selected for our fiction book club years ago, and that's how it kind of fell into my lap to be read. And my book club then absolutely loved World War II stories. So this is your World War II story. It's written in a series of letters telling of life during the German occupation and just after World War II on the island of Guernsey. What I really enjoyed about the story was that it was told in letters, and that there was a lot of discussion about books and food and friendships. It's just under 300 pages, and I think it's something that you just can't put down. You probably could read it in a weekend. If you got a weekend to just kind of lounge around and enjoy a good book, this is the one I would recommend.
It again. There we go. I feel like it was a really big book club book back then too. I remember lots of different book clubs reading it, and I feel like they always had a pretty positive reception from what they would tell me.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
All right, Sherry, what's next?
The Library of the Dead by T.L. Huchu. I think that's how you say his name. It's a new one. I think it just came out June 1st. It's the first in a series. And of course, if it has library in the title, I'm probably going to read it, or at least pick it up and see if it interests me. It's the story of Ropa. She's a Scottish teenager with Zimbabwean ancestry, and she talks with ghosts to help her family, which includes her grandma and her sister, earn money. She does this by passing along messages from the dead to the living families and friends, and then in exchange for money. She's drawn into helping a recently deceased mother find her missing son, which leads her to an occult library hidden in the center of Edinburgh, Scotland. The characters are fascinating and diverse. The world building is epic, and Edinburgh takes center stage in the book. Though it takes place in either an alternative Edinburgh or maybe a futuristic one, it's hard to tell. But I can't wait to read the next one. The book is promoted as Sixth Sense meets Stranger Things. At first, I didn't see the comparison to Stranger Things, but as the book goes on, you definitely do. So fun for people who love fantasy.
I think a good a good combination of two pretty popular things as well. And so people are waiting for the next season of Stranger Things to come out. They could maybe check this out.
Uh-huh.
All right. Nancy, do you have another mythological type book for us, or do you have something else?
I do not. I have a historical novel. I also love the World War I and World War II novels, and I branched out a little bit, and I read The Four Winds by KRISTIN Hanna. And first of all, anything you pick up from KRISTIN Hanna is awesome. She wrote The Nightingale and The Great Alone. The Four Winds is also a newer release. You might have to get on the hold list for it. But it talks about the Great Depression, and it talks about the Dust Bowl. I didn't know anything about it. And the Okies, they call them the Okies, those who come to farm, mainly pick cotton in other states. And, you know, I assume, and then I also fact check a little bit, but I'm assuming that even though it's a novel, the historical elements are in place for this story. So again, gives me a little bit of historical perspective, and I don't have to study history books. So it starts out in Texas in 1921, and this woman who considers herself homely marries an Italian boy, and the relationship really doesn't last, although they stay married, but she falls in love with her in-laws' farm and her in-laws. They're the family she never had. So she loves the farm and it's thriving, and then comes the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, and by 1934, everyone is struggling. And this book just gutted me, but I kept reading because I wanted to know the story of it. And it's just hard to understand that times were so hard back then. I mean, there's some good points. It shows how people survive even if they don't thrive, and it tells the story. So it was a good read. But, you know, reading books like this when we go through COVID and other things, it just puts things in perspective. We as an American people have had things so much worse at different times in history. So this was just a really, really good book.
All right. Have you read any other KRISTIN Hanna? You said
Yeah, I think I've probably read all of them. Yep, The Nightingale
okay.
and The Great Alone. I know I read definitely those two, but she's the type of writer you could read it. They're quite thick, but you could read it in a few days because it's written so well. You want to keep going with it. You want to know the rest of the story.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right, Chris, what's next?
So I think I mentioned that this month I had a lot of duds, and I just didn't want to talk about a bunch of books that I didn't like. So occasionally I post on my social media about books that I'm reading, and I ask other people, you know, hey, what can you recommend? So this next book is actually on my TBR pile. I'm really excited to read it because it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. As Sherry mentioned before, it's a mystery. It's The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. It was recommended to me from a former high school classmate who lives in Utah. So when I looked it up, I was like, "Oh, hey, this is gonna be good." It was published in September of 2020, so I checked on it just the other day, and there's copies available to check out. The story features 4 septuagenarians who regularly meet in their retirement village to discuss unsolved crimes. It turns out that a local developer winds up dead, and this group of friends gets to become real live detectives and be on a case for this murder. The reviews state that it's absolutely downright funny, which I really could stand to have some funniness right now. And I'm really looking forward to reading it in the next couple days.
Oh, there we go. I was afraid that the murder club would be that they were out murdering people. So I guess it's good that they're stopping them. They're trying to solve a murder. That it's a little more optimistic.
Yeah, and you know, I guess there's like a little thing you can. One of our coworkers purchased this "How to Solve a Crime" kit, and so when I saw this title of the book, I was like, "Oh, hey, I think I want to kind of read along and see how this story goes."
All right, Sherry, what is your next book?
It's On Honeymooners by Christina Lauren. It's romantic comedy, so it's perfect beach read. And it starts out with Olive and Ethan. They hate each other. Olive's identical twin is marrying Ethan's brother, so you can see that this may be a problem. The bride and groom succumb to food poisoning at their wedding, and they ask Olive and Ethan to take their place on their honeymoon to Hawaii, which sounds weird, but Amy got everything for free, and she didn't want the trip to go to waste. Amy's Olive's twin. So the two agree to go. And after a lot of snarkiness and some unexpected guests, including Olive's new boss and Ethan's ex-girlfriend, they actually have fun together and admit their attraction. Of course, in romance, true love doesn't run smoothly. And once they're back in their real lives, things start to go south. I really enjoy the dynamic between Ethan and Olive. Normally, I'm not a big fan of enemies to lovers in a romance, but these two were enemies due to a misunderstanding and some not so nice meddling by Ethan's brother. They're adorable together, and their dialogue's fantastic. I've been a fan of Christina Lauren since their first book, and that hasn't changed with this book. They mix sweet, snarky, and truly hilarious, and they do it really well. You can't go wrong with any of their books, but I think this one might be one of my favorites.
So there's a few like kind of lighter, more upbeat sounding stories, which is a break from maybe Nancy doesn't realize. I feel like a lot of the books we discuss are usually really depressing and really sad or really. So that's good. That's good. All right, Nancy, what do you have left to talk about?
I have a little hidden book. I don't think it got a lot of play. It's called Margreete's Harbor by Eleanor Morse. It's newer, but you can find it on the shelf. And it starts out, it's not comical, but the woman is comical. She's an elderly woman and she lives alone on the shore of Maine, and she's living alone. She forgets a hot pan on the stove and burns her kitchen down. So then she realizes she probably needs to tell her daughter. Her daughter lives in, I think, Michigan. Yeah, that caught my eye. She lives in Michigan. So her and her family decide to move to Maine and kind of take over her mother's house and take over her mother's life, which Margreete doesn't think she needs at this point. And clearly, all through the book, you figure out that she really does need someone to keep an eye on her, and she keeps going back and forth between the present and the past. So she is getting a touch of dementia, and it's not a sad book, and it's not all about the dementia. It actually leads you through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and present time. So you get a lot of the past, and she really fits the details in there well. It shows the kids, it's a husband and wife and her two kids, and it shows the husband and wife, their romance, they get married, they start having kids, their life turns a little mundane, now they're living in Maine, and it shows the two kids growing up too, so it focuses on each character in the story, and it spans a lot of time. And I would say the book is almost boring, but I kept reading because it's a nice little story. It reminds me of Olive Kitteridge or A Man Called Ove. The story just kind of rambles and you wonder where it's going, but at the end you feel like you know these characters from start to finish. So it's just kind of a sweet little book and a sweet little story about families, which is good after you read like a story about orphans or a story about World War II. You just kind of need a nice book in between the others. So I would consider this one of those.
This sounds nice. Okay, so something we've been trying to do is all of us have been trying to read the same book. I don't know if you know this, Nancy, because you kind of came in as a last-minute replacement here. And I'm interested in hearing what Chris's thoughts on the book were, because you said you had a lot of duds lately. So I'm interested what your thoughts were, Chris. Did you like it?
And that would be for the Ghostwood song.
The Ghostwood
by Eric
song.
Waters. Yeah. Okay. So I
Yes.
just finished it. I mean, sometimes I probably shouldn't judge a book on how long it takes me to read it, because that's probably not fair. I have other things going on in my life. But it did take me a little while to get into the story because I guess I don't believe in ghosts. So I had to suspend, belief for a little bit. But I would say that about this book is I really enjoyed the mystery aspect of it. And since it's a teen fiction book, I feel like there's not enough mysteries written for teens. And so teens who are looking for something that has mystery in it, I think would really like this story. So, and I did like, I guess I liked the place, the setting of the story. But I gave it like 3 stars.
Well, it's funny. I think maybe it is more up Sherry's alley because it kind of makes me think a little bit about Library of the Dead that you talked about. Did you end up getting to read this, Sherry?
I did. I enjoyed it. It wasn't my favorite book of all time or anything like that, but I did enjoy it. It was a little sad at times. It's definitely not one of those light feel-good books, but I did enjoy it.
Sherry, I'm kind of curious what you thought of the ghosts, because you like ghost stories, right?
I read more witch stories than ghost stories, so it's hard to say. I don't know. I'm not really sure how I feel about the ghost aspect of it.
Yeah, maybe it's KRISTIN who really likes the ghost stories. I remembered when I saw this book. Actually, my son's girlfriend is reading it. And that's what kind of brought me to it. And I remember thinking, oh, Sherry and KRISTIN will probably really like this. So that's, I don't normally read ghost stories. So that's why I wondered what other people thought.
I'm not opposed to ghost stories, but I had a really hard time getting into it. I didn't even get very far because I would sit down and read it. I just had it for whatever reason. It just didn't really, I had a hard time like latching onto it.
Yeah. And I think that too, Ryan, is probably what was some of my difficulty. Like I mentioned, it took me a long time to finish it. It's a book that I probably read for over 2 weeks. And I feel like, a teen fiction title that takes 2 weeks, what was going on there?
Right.
Yeah, it's not one, I felt like it wasn't one of those unputdownable books. It was one of those where I kind of had to struggle to read it. So it wasn't one of those where it's like, no, I'm going to ignore everything else I have to do and finish this book.
Yeah.
So maybe preview for next month is one of the books we thought about doing was called, that KRISTIN recommended, was called Tin Man. And I really enjoyed that book. And I won't talk about it too much now. Maybe I'm almost finished with it. But maybe that's what we can talk about next week, because it's 2 things I feel like. That's one, it's pretty depressing. It's pretty pretty heavy. So I feel like that fits in with a lot of the books that we talk about. But also it kind of reminds me of what Nancy just spoke about, Margreete Harbor. It reminds me a little bit of that. So I don't know if you've read that, Nancy, but maybe if you'd want to check it out, we could try and have you back next time too. Sure. I think you might be interested in it. I really enjoyed it.
Ryan, what is our next date? So maybe our viewers can.
That's a good question. Let me pull it up. I believe it's early in July, but let me look at it really quick. I'll pull it up here. It is July 6th. Another Tuesday.
Okay, so Nancy, how about you take my spot, because I will be on vacation.
Oh,
you can read the Tin Man.
I can do that.
Well, that works out. That's pretty convenient then. So Tin Man. Maybe we'll make the call now then, if you guys are both interested in that. If Sherry and Nancy would want to try reading that. I know that KRISTIN was her recommendation, and it was Tin Man by Sarah Winman. All right. Well, thank you for the three of you for joining me here today. And thank you everyone who is watching this, whether you're watching it live or watching a recording. Please leave your thoughts and comments on any of these books, or even suggestions about maybe what you'd want us to see us talk about next. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. That was fun.
Thank you.
Bye.